So the midterm exam went pretty well for a bunch of students, and there were a handful that it didn't go so well. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk a little bit about it and maybe give those that didn't do so well an opportunity to try to do better. So first I wanted to just take a look at the HTML file. There's nothing too spectacular about it. You'll notice that we did have 3 input boxes, and those 3 input boxes were just labeled in1 and in2 and in3. So those were the names of the input boxes. There's one output box, the text area here, and I just labeled that one output. The other user interface items are simply the buttons, and so the buttons we're going to call the 5 actual problems that are out on the JavaScript page. And so those buttons were already pre-programmed to call those functions on the JavaScript page. So let's take a look at the JavaScript. On the JavaScript page, of course, you'll notice then that I've got some code in here for the various problems, and I just wanted to share with you how some of this code works so that you can then understand a little bit better about how to call functions and how to use some of these helper functions, and also how the midterm is organized. So here's problem 1 function. So any code that I put in this function will be executed when I click the problem 1 button on the user interface. So before I actually take a look at some of the code that I've written here just for demonstration purposes, I want to go down and take a look at the actual helper functions themselves. So we'll scroll on down here. The very first helper function that's actually useful is this one called getInput1. And you'll notice if you read this helper function, all it simply does is call getElement with the name or ID of that input1 box. Now, getElement, of course, was just defined right above. And all getElement does is it does a very simple thing of the document getElement by ID, and it uses the ID that's passed into the function. So that will grab the actual element from the HTML page given the ID. So what getInput1 then does is getInput1 gets that HTML element in a very convenient fashion and puts it into this variable called input. And then the return from the function simply returns the value property of that HTML element. So this function makes getting the value from that HTML element very convenient. And this is the kind of thing that you would do in your program just to make it easy to access things. You'll notice I don't have to say document getElement by ID over and over and over again. That's all done right here, and I simply call this over and over. So these are convenience functions, and they definitely are convenient. And this is the kind of thing that programmers will do if they find themselves having to type a bunch of code like that getElement by ID over and over again. They will make a convenience function. So I've provided for you convenience functions for getting the values from all 3 of those input boxes. And you'll see up above how I use these. Now the next convenience functions that are provided are the print and print line functions. The print and print line functions simply take an argument. You'll notice it says argument X here. It takes that argument, gets the output element, that's the output box, gets that, and then simply updates the value of that text area so that you don't have to do this over and over again yourself. You just call the print function and it immediately outputs to that text area. Now there's 2 of these, and you'll notice in the little comment block above it says this one outputs to the HTML element. It does not add a line break on the end. Whereas the print line function, if you call print line, that's an LN on that print line. And that's a very common name for outputting and then doing a line break. So this one actually does output the line break. So if you call print line, all it does is takes the value you pass in, adds the line break character onto the end of it, and then calls the print function so that you will get a line break when you use this function. And that's probably the most common function you would use, but it's every now and again it's nice to be able to print something on a single line and then call print again and have the next element print on the same line. So this gives you the maximum flexibility. The next function that you see is the isNumeric function. Now this isNumeric function is a little bit difficult to understand if you try to read it, but you don't need to read it. All you need to know is that it will return a true or false value depending upon whether the argument passed in is a number or not. So this is an extremely useful function that you can test to see if the input that the user has given you is a number. The last one down here, well, I'm skipping over the clear function. It simply clears the output box. But the last one down here is simply a rounding function that allows you to pass in a number and how many decimal places you'd like that number to have, and it will return that value to you with that many number of decimal places. So it's a nice little convenient function too for rounding a number to a particular number of decimal places. Now this is not that difficult to understand, but if you were going to try to step through this, I would suggest you actually write this down on a piece of paper and pencil. Like take some value like 10.349 and say you want to round it to 2 places or 1 place, and then just step through and see what this thing does to the number, and maybe have a little calculator handy. Essentially what it does is it moves the decimal point over 2 places to the right by multiplying times a certain power of 10, rounds it using the math.round built into JavaScript, and then moves the decimal point back over by doing the division. And then it simply returns that value back to the caller. So let's take a look at some of the problems at the top. So the very first problem that we come to is a relatively simple input of 3 values. So you get the values out of input box 1, 2, and 3, and that in this particular case it simply represented a first name, a middle initial, and the last name. And then it calls the print line function and prints out those values with the comma separator. Notice it's last name, then first name, then middle initial. So if we enter those values in the input boxes, I'll go ahead and do an example here with a first name, a middle initial, and a last name. And then I'll click the program 1 button and let's see what happens. And it prints it out with last name, comma, space, first name, space, middle initial with a period after the middle initial. So that's pretty straightforward, but again, notice how it was done. This get input 1 simply gets the value from input box 1 and stores it into a variable, and does the same thing with the next 3. And it just calls the function that's tied to the button. So all the code for that was just right inside this particular function block. So you can just see all the code was right inside that functions block. So let's take a look at problem number 2. Problem number 2 is another relatively simple problem that's going to ask for 3 numbers to see whether or not they possibly form a right triangle. So we get the input values again and just store them in the sides of a right triangle, A, B, and C here. And so again, it's very convenient to call get input without having to do the document.getElementById or having to take the value of the HTML element. It takes care of all that. Now here's the first use you see of the isNumeric method or function. The isNumeric function simply says, is a number? That's all it's asking, and it returns a true or false. And for this particular problem, we wanted all 3 to be a number, so we said, is a number, and is B a number, and is C a number? Now, the AND operation works just like it would in your day-to-day life. If all 3 need to be numeric, you'd have to say AND. If you use an OR, it implies that one of them could be numeric and the other's not, and that's not what you would want, of course. So the next thing we do is if all 3 are numeric, we just do the test to see if it's a possible right triangle, and that's using the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus B squared equals c squared. If that's true, then we do indeed have a right triangle. If it's false, we don't have a right triangle. Now again, notice testing for equality, it is almost always done with the equals, not just equal. And I'll talk later about that difference, but right now all you need to know is if you want to test for equality, that is the appropriate operation to use. Notice if they did not enter 3 numbers, we do have an else block down here that gives them a little message saying that they didn't input 3 numbers. So this is a very simple example of doing an input error checking. And in this case, it actually is pretty useful, and all we did was check to see if they were numbers, and then if they weren't, we gave them a little prompt. Problem 3 is just another example of something similar, but I wanted to demonstrate another idea in problem 3 that some people are having a little bit of a difficulty with. Problem 3 simply inputs the width and the length of a rectangle, and it's going to calculate the area in the perimeter. Now, for starters, I want you to notice that all 4 of the variables that I wanted to use for my little function here are all declared at the top. Now, the width and the length, of course, I'm getting from the input boxes. The area in the perimeter I'm going to calculate, but notice I declared them up here at the top, and I did initialize those to 0. So a basic rule in JavaScript is to declare all your variables at the very top of your function and initialize every variable. And if you don't have something reasonable to initialize it to, initializing to 0 is always a good choice, but do initialize it. Now you might say that I could have possibly calculated width and length, used width and length to calculate area right here to initialize area. But what would have happened if the user did not type in a number for width and or length? Then trying to do the calculation here would cause an error, and that's not what you want to do. So what we had to do, of course, is we needed an if statement to check to see if those 2 input values were numeric. And so we did that. And both of them had to be numeric. So again, of course, we had to use the AND operation saying, is length numeric and is width numeric? Well, if those both came back true, then we'd get inside of our if block, and we know we have numbers, and we can go ahead and do the calculations. Now, there is something we didn't check that would have been a probably useful thing to check, but checking user input errors can get kind of messy, and it's sort of a waste of time when you're just trying to learn how to program the basics. We didn't check here to see if we got positive numbers. That would be something else, of course, in a more robust program that you might want to check. So we go ahead and calculate the area, then we calculate the width. Now I want you to notice how I calculated the width here, because one of the issues that we find when we're working with numbers is that the plus operation, unfortunately, has 2 purposes in JavaScript. The plus operation is used to add things together, such as these numbers that we have. So we take 2 times the width and we add it to 2 times the length. But you'll notice in the statement just below that we also use the plus operator to concatenate things together. So here we're concatenating this little string width here inside the quotes to the number width. And so this causes problems. Now, if I had actually tried to do something a little different, like saying perimeter is, let's say, well, what would I say there? I could say width plus length times length, and that would have then concatenated them all together. And why is that? It's because when we do get input from our web page, everything we input is a string. And even if it looks like a number, it's still a string. Now, the editor I'm using right now, you'll notice won't let me type anything, unfortunately. So what I would have done, of course, is I would have had to, if I wanted to just do addition with numbers, addition, because it's used 2 different ways in JavaScript, addition needs to be told, are you working with numbers or are you working with strings? So some of you have been using the idea of multiplying your input value times 1 to turn it into a number, and that indeed is an effective way to do that. There are several other ways to do that, but right now, if you want to just use that, go ahead and do that. I just want to continue talking about this right now. So again, I calculated my area and my perimeter, and then I just did a bunch of output and printed the values to the output box. Notice though how much nicer it is to print to the output box when I can just say print line and tell it what to print, and it spits it right into my output box. That's similar to console.log outputting to the console window, but we wanted to actually output to the text area, and so this print line statement makes that very simple. And again, notice if there was a mistake on the inputs, we had an else statement down here that would give the person a heads up. Let's take a quick look at the next two. They're pretty fast. This one was inputting a value that was the radius of a circle. Then we wanted to calculate the area and the circumference. So we come on down, and again, notice I used the is numeric to check to see if radius was numeric. Then I calculated the circumference by using the math.py object that's in the JavaScript library under the math heading. And so here is an example of using the round function that we talked about down below. Because I'm using math.py here, it has many, many decimal places of precision, approximately 15. And so when I do the multiplication, I'm going to have a lot of decimal values after the decimal point. And so if I call new round and I give it circumference and I tell it I want 2 decimal places, it goes ahead and actually then updates circumference to have the 2 decimal places. I did the same thing here with area. And then we go ahead and print that out, and it prints out with just the 2 decimal places. And finally, as you can see here, I did the same thing in problem number 5. I wanted to test that out. So if we come over to the output window here, I can put a number into my input box, just some decimal number. How about 12.3456789? And I'll hit program button 5 because that is the function that I have the code in. It's in problem number 5, so I'll hit program 5. And it outputs the original number and then shows you rounding it to 1, 2, 3, and 4 decimal places. So you see how it nicely rounds that to those different decimal places. So I hope this has clarified some things about the various interactions between the web page and our functions that we have here that are tied to our buttons, and also how some of the helper functions work when you want to try to solve the problem. These are very nice convenience functions. Now I did give these functions to you several days before the exam started, and I was kind of hoping you would experiment and use some of these to get a feel for how they worked. I think some of you did that. So anyway, please let me know if you have any questions about this. I will follow up later with an opportunity for you maybe to improve your score on the midterm exam. Thank you.